everyone. So let's get into Chapter 1 a little bit further and start talking about where democracy, especially American democracy, actually comes from. So we can trace back democracy to ancient Greece and Athenian ideas of what democracy is, what it should be, and those definitions of citizenship. History Channel did a great documentary on the birth of democracy that really looks into ideas about where did we first develop a notion that everyone should participate in developing the rules and institutions for our government. Now, while we have this origin of democracy in ancient Greece, that model really dissipates quickly. And through the Middle Ages especially, we see that tends to be a lot of those authoritarian regimes, specifically the monarchs. And that's because the understanding of who should have power was based on some sort of divine right. So it came from God and then past God lineage. But when we get into the Enlightenment era, which you may have already heard about in a philosophy class or history class, really the paradigm shifts and we no longer think about power being derived from God, but authority. God might still have power, but authority, the power to do things, to decide, suddenly becomes based on rationality, reason. If you're able to engage in reason, then under Enlightenment thought, you should also be able to confer rights upon yourself and others, and you should be able to make decisions, i.e. the idea of autonomy really emerges with Enlightenment thinking. Moving forward then, when we apply this idea of rationality gives you rights, we get into the notion of a social contract. We can't just all have rights and no institutions, the theory goes. So instead, society is based on this agreement that I'll claim my rights, you'll claim your rights, and we'll concede that the government regulates these rights as long as the government is following what we want it to do. Another way to think about this is the idea that if a government is no longer fulfilling the needs of the people or responding to the people, then under social contract theory, we should devolve that government and get a new one. We give up some of our autonomy in order to have safety and regulation and a government that provides some stability for our society. Now, we have a couple of theorists that really brought this into American thought by influencing, in particular, Thomas Jefferson. Two of the people that he was obviously familiar with based on the writing of the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution, but especially the Declaration of Independence, was John Locke, who really said that we can have government without a social contract, but that government isn't legitimate. So in his view, monarchs were often illegitimate because if they don't have the consent of the people, and if the government breaks that contract, breaks the idea of following the people's will, then the government no longer has legitimacy. Hobbes has a very similar idea, and as you can see, he wrote a little bit prior to Locke and provides some additional lenses to think about this. Government shouldn't exist in the view of Hobbes just to exist or based on a divine right. Instead, governments should exist in order to regulate public interaction. When we combine these two things, we get the premises on which the Declaration of Independence is derived. Now, those two ideas, especially Locke, is how Jefferson and the other founders of our nation, and I'll use that term loosely because I think there are problems with it, this is how they justified revolution. When is a revolution justified? Well, when the government is no longer fulfilling the needs of the people. So, what about right now? Is revolution justified, either in the US or anywhere in the world? Thinking about things like the events in Baltimore, or the way in which the people are currently regulated in Iran or in Yemen. Are these places where revolution is justified? And if so, how does that justification relate to Locke's ideas? So we have Thomas Jefferson establishing this idea of social contract theory, but amongst the other authors of our founding documents, we had a lot of contention over what exactly democracy should look like, whose consent was really important, and how that consent should be translated into actual power. So James Madison, who wrote many of the Federalist Papers, really was concerned with the idea of pure democracy. He said that people individually might not necessarily make the best decisions, and instead would pursue only their self-interest. So if we have everyone voting on everything, right, everything's initiatives and referendums, he thinks nothing gets done because everyone's pursuing their individual self-interest. And then we end up with groups that are only pursuing their group interest, and these groups interact with each other in conflict and nothing gets done. So for Madison, he said one of the ways around this is this idea of a republic, which is a particular type of democracy and should not be confused with Republican, the political party. A republic is just a representative democracy. It means that instead of voting on every single bill that that we're trying to pass, we elect representatives, and those representatives in turn make the decisions on the bills. He also didn't think that average Americans could consider what the broader public needed. So part of his idea of a republic is that those who are elected should have what he called Republican virtue, or be able to use what we'll call later a trustee model of representation, that they will take into account the needs of the citizens more than their individual needs. So is that what we see today? Are senators, representatives, and the president more interested in their personal best interests, or in that for the public in which they represent?